Hey guys, welcome back to the Bulwark. I am Sam Stein, managing editor at the Bulwark. I am joined by Joe Perticone, who is the author of Press Pass, which is our newsletter on all things happening in Congress. Everyone should subscribe. It's a great read. Comes out Tuesday and Thursday, and occasionally we do some special editions. I know we have a few of those coming up. Joe, thanks for joining us here. We're going to talk today about today's version of Press Pass, which looks at the situation in North Carolina. Mark Robinson, gubernatorial candidate there. To say he is beset by scandal probably does a disservice to the word scandal. I don't think I've ever seen as many problems surrounding a candidate as we have with Mark Robinson. Joe, you went around, you talked to some folks on the Hill about the situation there, but you asked a very specific question, which is, should the party do more to pre-vet candidates before they get nominated? In this case, it seemed like everyone sort of knew that Mark Robinson was a ticking time bomb. I don't think they knew exactly the extent of the blast radius. What did you find from folks on the Hill?
So Robinson is the latest horribly toxic candidate who will probably go on to lose. There's a huge list going back more than a decade. But he was interesting because they've ditched support for him financially, and no one's appearing with him. Trump held a rally in North Carolina on Saturday and didn't mention his name despite being pals with him until the moment the most recent story broke. And so it was just interesting that, suddenly they're distancing. As I note in the piece, that wasn't necessarily the case with Roy Moore in 2017 because that was a special election. So it's not so much a departure from him because there is this moral objection to this very toxic candidate. It's a question of resource allocation. And so why don't they put in a more concerted effort to stop these candidates from emerging so these problems don't happen?
Let's go through the list here. This is not a Robinson only phenomenon, right? Like Roy Moore, you mentioned, Eric Greitens, Herschel Walker, Christine O'Donnell, Richard Murdoch, Sharon Angle. You could argue Dr. Oz. There is a lengthy history of Republicans nominating candidates who are well outside the mainstream and then suffering the consequences in terms of lost races. And I think it's important to note this is something that predates Trump, right? Like Trump for a version of 2016 seemed like the latest in this pattern, but then he went in and won. So when you talk to folks on the Hill, do they think this is a Trump problem? Do they think this is a voter problem? How do they diagnose this?
So when you talk to Republicans on Capitol Hill, nothing is ever Trump's problem. It's always like a distance from him. And This is kind of the same thing. I spoke to Senator Jerry Moran, and he is senator from Kansas, mild-mannered guy, but he was the chairman of the Senate Republicans campaign arm in 2014, which was probably the only year in recent memory where they said, none of these crazy candidates, we're only going to push normies through the primary. And then they won. They took back the Senate after a 7-year drought. And it was hugely successful. And this was the failed opportunity, as they could have taken back the Senate maybe in 2010, the way they had that wave year for the House. There's a missed opportunity again in 2012, and that's because they were nominating people like self-proclaimed witches and you name
that
it.
would be Christine O'Donnell.
I'm not a witch.
Yeah, just blowing these chances, and they decided not to do it, and they elected a lot of normie people like Joni Ernst. Joni Ernst is a very normal senator who has staying power and probably won't lose as long as she runs. And so I asked him, and his thing was, well, you have to be concerned about, you don't want to vote for the voters. And then he was like, political parties aren't very powerful entities. And I said to him, well, don't you think that the Democratic Party is a very powerful entity? They just got their sitting president to step aside for the interests of winning an election. And he was kind of like, I can't speak to them, but I know that we're not very powerful.
Well, and with Robinson, right? The news that broke with him, and again, it's like a cornucopia of ridiculous statements and scandals, claiming himself to be a black Nazi was maybe not even the worst thing that surfaced, which is remarkable. But the news broke right before the deadline for taking his name off of the ballot. And for a brief period of time, there was questions about, well, would that happen? Like, could the party move and intervene and try to get him off? And then it just sort of passed, and everyone was like, you know what? Never going to happen. Can't happen. And I guess the question is, why not? Right?
Right. Well, because another component of the Trump era is that you can't apologize for anything. Trump never apologizes. And for you to apologize is to show weakness and to look like you're not a team player. And so that's why you had Senator Ted Budd from North Carolina, when there was basically a few hours to push this guy out of the race to have a fighting chance. Ted Budd's reaction was not, I condemn everything about this. It is abhorrent. We need someone new, which would have been probably the typical response in the Democratic Party to something like that. Ted Budd's response was, I don't know what's true and I don't know what's not true. We need to see this through the weekend. Well, seeing it through the weekend cemented him to remain on the ballot. And that's how they react to this thing. And even Tom Tillis, who is at least in his temperament, very moderate Republican senator, I gave him ample opportunities to say, do you believe the reporting about Robinson? And it was just, I don't know what to believe, or he should sue.
Well, let me read the quote. You quote from Tillis when you asked him is, quote, "It doesn't matter to me what I think Robinson needs to do. If he has a factual basis for it, he should bring a lawsuit and make a lot of money against CNN. And if the reporting is true, then he needs to move on." So just sort of like not trusting the reporting and saying, well, sue CNN if you have a case.
And so Tillis will be up for re-election in 2 years. He's going to draw a much more right-wing primary challenger. And the way he handled questions about this and has all day, like after I talked to him and I saw him come back down, he was swarmed by other reporters. I just got him early. All about Mark Robinson, and he was giving these very calculated, lawyerly answers to avoid maybe the wrath that's going to come in 2 years when he gets a primary challenger of being, oh, you're not a true Republican, you didn't stand and fight, instead of very unequivocally condemning him. Tillis is someone who typically would have condemned someone like Robinson, but knows, I think, that it's a risk to do so. That's not going to soften or stop any kind of primary challenge, but maybe he thinks it does.
Did Tillis say anything to you about his fears that this might the fallout of this might extend into the presidential contest?
He was very dodgy about that. Most of them were. They just were like, this is an isolated incident, is what the message they were trying to get across. But as we know from history, the candidates we just named, it is not an isolated incident, which is why I wanted to ask them, like, how do you prevent this from repeating itself as it has done time and time and time again?
Yeah. And I guess I'm sort of left a little bit dissatisfied by Moran's answer, right? He's like, well, we tried to attract candidates that could succeed both in the primary and the general, but also the party doesn't really have much power to do so. I mean, to me, that just sort of reads like we got lucky.
Yeah. And a point he made to me was that, Steve Daines, who's the NRSC chairman this cycle, he was like, he's kind of doing the same thing. And that's true to a certain extent. So the candidates, he recruited like Larry Hogan in Maryland. That's the only chance you have for even somewhat of a competitive race. You saw Dave McCormick. It was their pick to be the guy in Pennsylvania. The problem with those is that like another strategy that's emerged was not proper vetting and convincing primary voters of candidates' toxicity. Their strategy this cycle was to recruit millionaires who can self-fund themselves. And so that's Dave, McCormick, that's Eric Hovde in Wisconsin. But a really good example is in Montana this cycle. So Tim Sheehy is a retired Navy SEAL. He doesn't have the baggage that the other challenger who was emerging was Matt Rosendale, who's a Freedom Caucus guy in the House. He's already lost to John Tester before, would have been a terrible choice again. And they successfully pressured him not to run. And so Republicans are very confident that this cycle, they've produced a good enough field, but you're already seeing that may not be the case. If you look at Ohio and if you look at all of these Senate candidates, with the exception of Larry Hogan, are running behind Trump in the polls.
Well, and I will say this, in this cycle, I mean, I think if you just look at it across the board, they did get good candidates. It didn't mean that they were going to be successful in the general election. But the difference between this cycle is that they got Trump to back those candidates. And the reason that Robinson kind of stood out is that Trump also backed Robinson, called him Martin Luther King on steroids.
This is Martin Luther King on steroids.
So it strikes me that the solution here is basically to try to get Trump to just kind of pick the candidate you think will do best in terms of a general election and hope that it sticks. It doesn't always work. In some cases, Trump will endorse a Robinson type figure, but that's where the party's at.
Yeah, it's try to get Trump to endorse the least Trumpy candidate.
Can you recall right now, is there a candidate, who's the most recent candidate in a primary, GOP primary, who didn't have Trump's endorsement, a competitive GOP primary who didn't have Trump's endorsement and won? It's hard.
I'm trying to think. I think there's more examples at the House level.
Right. But this is tough, right? Like it's just kind of,
or for example,
you have to have Trump's.
In Georgia, you had Brian Kemp, yeah, and you had like people he's publicly feuded with, and then he used to always say, "I'm undefeated on my primary endorsements," and that stopped being true. But now he's also done a thing where he endorses multiple candidates in the same primary, which.
Yes.
I guess
and then whoever wins, like in the Blake Masters contest where, that's true. All right. Well, listen, people should read the piece. It gets at a really interesting dynamic here, which is how does the GOP stop nominating crazy people and whether they can or cannot. Joe, thank you so much, man. Everyone check out Joe's latest press pass at the Bulwark. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube page and we'll be in touch. Joe, thanks a lot, man.